Greetings. My name is Michael Wehmeyer, and I'm at the University of Kansas. And what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking with you about is the important role of families in promoting and enhancing the self-determination of young people with disabilities. My colleagues and I have spent the last 30 years really developing systems and supports that enable schools and teachers primarily to promote self-determination as an important transition-related activity to enhance outcomes for young people as they transition to adulthood. And I've recorded other videos in this series that are aimed at teachers as an audience, but certainly some of those may have interest to you if you're the parent or family member of a young person who's going through the transition process. You can get a better sense of what effective practice looks like in schools. But what I'd like to do in the short time we have is to talk about, as I mentioned, the important role that families have. So I'm going to just very briefly touch on what is self-determination and why is it important. Then I'm going to talk about some of the things particularly that families can do, because of course there really is no more important system than the family system when it comes to young people becoming self-determined. So we need to begin by understanding what this thing is, because there's a great deal of, I think, miscommunication, misinterpretation. The ideas around self-determination go back into the 17th century. But fundamentally, there are sort of two different meanings, if you will, of the term. One is about oneself and the determination of one's own fate. So and I will say it again, we talk about this in terms of making things happen in your own life rather than someone or something else making things happen. So we want to enable young people. You want to enable your adolescent to make things happen in their own lives. It's not the same thing as being independent. We'll talk more about that momentarily. The other meaning is this sense of self-determination as self-governance, as autonomy, as freedom, and independence. And, you know, in some senses, in some occasions, you will hear self-determination talked about in those sense. I'll come back to that in a moment. I said the understandings of self-determination go back centuries. What you need to understand is that self-determination is linked to this idea of determinism, which is the idea that everything is caused in some way, shape, or form. So self-determination or self-determinism refers to self-caused action versus other caused action. Again, making things happen in one's own life. But within the disability rights and advocacy movement context, there is the broader sense of self-determination as a right, as synonymous with independence. It's linked in disability to issues of empowerment, because people with disabilities as a group are often lack power, lack opportunities to have any sense of control in their lives. And so it's logical that as the disability rights movement emerged in the late 20th century, they embraced ideas related to self-determination. But even in those senses, it refers not only to the sense that people with disabilities as a group have rights to self-governance and independence and that, but also as individuals, people with disability have a right to make decisions that impact their own lives instead of somebody else making those decisions, or at least be involved in decisions that impact one's life. When people with disability talk about self-determination, there are clear themes that illustrate its importance in all of our lives, really. Jean-Paul Bovey is a man with autism who's been very active in the national self-advocacy movement. He says people with autism should be treated with the same dignity, respect, and equality as people without autism. So when he's talking about self-determination, he's not even using the term self-determination. Dignity, respect, equality. Bob Williams is been a leader at the federal level in disability for decades. He has personal experience with disability himself. And he says, we, meaning people with disabilities, don't have to be told what self-determination means. We know it is just another word for a life filled with rising expectations, dignity, respect, and opportunities. And so, you know, I think that what we all want as parents and as siblings and as family members is we want the people we love to have opportunities, to be held to high expectations, to be seen as worthy and equal and with respect and treated with dignity, and to have opportunities to live richer lives. And one of the ways that we, both we as schools and we as parts of families, achieve this vision is that we enable young people to become more self-determined. In our own work, we've talked about people with being people who are self-determined as causal agents in their lives, and it just reinforces this idea of self-determination is not about doing everything yourself. It's not independence in the sense of you don't need anyone's help. All of us utilize the knowledge, skills, and resources of others around us to achieve our own goals and objectives. Whether it's having somebody prepare our taxes because that person will, do a better job than we do, to obviously having a surgeon perform a complex surgery. We're not going to do things ourselves. And it's, life is about interdependence. And so being a causal agent in one's life is simply making things happen in one's life. And it doesn't have anything at all to do with doing things yourself. So young people who need support, who need either someone else or the use of technology, whatever, that enable them to function more successfully in their lives, can in fact be fully self-determined. I don't know any young person who can't become more self-determined, and it has to do with providing opportunities for young people to make choices, to engage in decisions, even if you're not able to independently make complex decisions. The fact that students are actively engaged in the decision-making process, that decisions are made based upon student preferences and interests. Students have a role in setting goals about their life. None of those are things that students have to learn to do independently, although a great many students will become quite capable of doing these things if given opportunities. But it's really about being at the heart of the process. And so everything we do, we need to enable young people to become causal agents by providing opportunities for students to learn about preferences, to express preferences, to be engaged in goal setting, such as the transition planning process, uh, to, um, to make choices about what they do and when they do it, to be engaged in decision making, to learn how to self-regulate and to self-manage their own lives. Again, I've gone into greater detail on these in another video in this series. If you're interested in greater depth in those, I recommend that you look at that. But being self-determined is about making things happen in your life. As human beings, we develop the capacity, we become self-determined, if you will, through a number of ways. First of all, we do acquire skills that enable us to function more successfully and to take on activities that enable us to be self-determined. For young children, this involves developmental milestones. Young people, communication is an important element of being self-determined. You express what your preferences are, you are engaged, you communicate to others. For students who don't communicate verbally, it's really important that young people are provided opportunities to both have ways to communicate what their preferences are and to communicate in general, but also that students are respected and honored and listened to if they're using alternative communication means. Often, for example, a young person who uses an alternative or augmentative communication device may be interrupted by people finishing their sentence for them. So, but there are lots of skills, particularly as we head into adolescence and young adulthood. These are things that often young people without disability sort of acquire on their own and take problem solving. You learn to problem solve by engaging in problem solving activities. But really for all young people, but particularly for young people with disability, it's important that they have explicit opportunities to learn how to solve problems, to make decisions, to set goals. Again, we've done this for 30 years. My one universal truism is that I'm always surprised with how well students do, or how much more students, young people do on these things if given opportunities. So there's this skill, knowledge acquisition, but it's also about letting young people do things. We need to create homes and schools that promote choice and control and give students lots of opportunity and not do things to them and are overly dependency creating. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, ability is of little account without opportunity. Young people can't learn how to be self-determined unless they're provided opportunities to engage in all of these important actions that enable them to be causal agents in their life. And these can be little things. They don't have to be huge. We're not just only talking about decisions that impact one's life in major ways. We're talking about day to day, what to wear, who to spend time with, having some voice in what you're doing. Young children and even into adolescence, they're still, young people are still dependent upon family members and adults in their lives in ways they won't be as they head into adulthood, perhaps. But if you think about typical adolescent development, there's a process of shifting the responsibility for one's life from adults, parents, family members to the young person themselves. So opportunity is a huge part of it. And then supports and accommodations. I have the privilege of traveling extensively over the world to talk about these issues. I wouldn't get by unless I had the supports in place that enable me to function in environments that are unfamiliar to me. You know, whether it's my GPS map on my phone app or whatever. So we need to put in place supports. Sometimes those supports are other people. Families often end up being the most important support for a young person, providing transportation or doing things. The key, I think, is understanding when though providing supports become in some way dependency creating and overly involved in the student's life, and when you can identify another way that a student might be able to do that. So capacity enhancement, opportunity, and then putting in place supports and accommodations. I just want you to know that there are interventions in place to promote self-determination that have good evidence of their positive impact. This is not just me saying I think this is important. We have very strong evidence of the importance of promoting self-determination on the outcomes for young people, both employment, community inclusion outcomes, and on school-related outcomes. Young people who are more self-determined achieve more positive outcomes both in school and post-school, and there are multiple interventions. I'll give you a link at the end of this that you can go to if you want and share that information with educators. Some of these actually can be adapted and used as part of what you do as a parent. But I would argue that we have a strong evidence of the importance of promoting self-determination to more positive transition outcomes as any transition-related practice. I say strong of evidence. There's lots of things that are important, but it's just to make the case that we know that this is important. We have multiple studies, both over a long period of time, but meta-analyses that looked at which are basically studies of studies, showing that young people can acquire these component elements, we call them, of self-determined choice making, decision making, problem solving, goal setting and attainment, self-advocacy, self-regulation. All of these things, if taught, young people can become better at these things. And it's particularly important that we put young people into the role of teaching themselves. So self-directed and self-determined learning becomes really important. So, we've done a lot of work on a model of teaching that enables teachers to teach students to teach themselves. But there are a number of practices that are out there that have evidence. Another important element of promoting self-determination is active student involvement in the transition planning process, and for that matter, educational planning in general. There are, again, a number of interventions that have good evidence of their impact both on student capacity to be involved in their own educational planning. So students learn how to set goals and solve problems and be engaged in planning for their own future, as well as on the impact of these on positive outcomes, including promoting and enhancing self-determination. We know that young people who are more self-determined are more likely to be involved in their own planning, and that students who are engaged in their own planning become more self-determined. So there's a reciprocal benefit there. And you can see there are lots of these sources that are online. I'll come back to these again. But many of these are of no cost. And in many cases, I know we developed Whose Future Is It Anyway? And we make it freely available. And on many occasions, I've had families take and adapt and use that material, even though it was initially developed to be used within schools. So let me wrap up then by talking about the critical importance of family. My friends and colleagues at the University of Kansas, Ann and Rudd Turnbull, were and are leaders in family systems and family participation and the role of families in the lives of children and young adults with disability. And they once described uh, issues of self-determination in a family context as being best understood as a mobile. Mostly we think of these mobiles um, dangling over very young babies' cribs, and they're each got these strings hanging down. There's some colorful object, and the baby is interested in them and may kick at or wave at and hit these things. They sometimes turn. The fancy ones have music. But one of the things that if you, as parents, we've likely experienced is that it doesn't take much for those things to get out of whack. If you hit one thing, gets tangled up, the next thing you know, the whole mobile has collapsed. And that is true with issues of self-determination in the family. Children with disability can require a lot of time and a lot of effort. That may be joyful, but the fact is there's disproportionate amount of time. There's, you're dealing with schools, you're dealing with multiple systems, all of those things. And it's easy to say, oh, you must promote self-determination, but focusing only on that child or that young person, they get the mobile out of whack. You've got to have a balance in your family. So it's important that you focus on your own self-determination. And in so doing, you have a better, I think, energy, sense of proportion in terms of I guess the point is you don't have to do only things that focus on your son or daughter's self-determination. Some of that actually will come naturally. So what are some of the things that you can do as a family? So I've referred to this already. You have to walk the tightrope between protection and independence, or protection and enhancing self-determination. You've got to allow your young adult to explore their world. It can be scary sometimes to let go, and that's true for all parents, but more so for parents of children and young adults with disability. Encourage your child. I use the term child here because in a broader sense, not just young person, to ask questions and to develop and express opinions, and get young people involved in family discussions and decision making. Turn over meaningful roles in terms of providing opportunities to make decisions that relate to them. And even if a decision goes a way that the young person would prefer not, so they don't get their way, if you will, research is pretty clear that if students have been involved in that process, they still see it as a nurturing experience, even though they may not express that immediately. And it enables them to, there's a degree of autonomy support that's there, even if the decision was one that wasn't their exact preference. Goals are important, but we often emphasize too much the outcome of goals. It's the process of goals. So we need to recognize the process of reaching goals. The goal orientation process, and I'm not talking about the kinds of goals that have to be written on school documents. I'm talking about kinds of goals that we all set in our lives. Goals motivate us, goals direct us. It's very important to enable young people to become goal focused and goal oriented, and to kind of make that really an automatic part of their lives. Um, it's so important. Young people learn so much from other young people. You just have to really uh, work very hard to ensure plenty of opportunities for young people with disabilities to just be young people and to do the things that other young people do, and to learn about other young people, and people who might be different in one way or another. Um, these young people, the other people, young people are going to be their colleagues, their friends, their co-workers. So they need to be part of society. They need to be part of community, particularly in high school. Such an important role in the social elements of high school. Choice making is an important element. If you think about typically developing young people, they make a lot of choices by the time they get to high school, and we need to ensure that young people with disabilities have many opportunities to make choices, both at home and within the context of school. And maybe they need support to make choices that are more consistent, or really in their better interest. But there are just lots of opportunities. So don't leave choice making opportunities to chance. Have high expectations, and don't be afraid to hope. Don't listen to people who tell you that your son or daughter, your young adult can't do something. There's almost always a way to figure out how, if there is a task that a young person can't specifically do, there are probably lots of ways that the student can get to where they want to be in alternatives. So it's so much, it is about having high expectations, and not limiting your young adult by our own. And schools are as guilty about this as anyone, of saying, of having low expectations that may be predicated on the disability and how it's understood, rather than the capacity and the strength of the young person. We're heading into an era where we're focusing more on strengths, and that's a really important element, I think. I once heard somebody say that they didn't know why people talk so much about having false hope, since hope was the only thing that gave them impetus to continue. There is no such thing as hope. Is hope. No such thing as false hope. Hope is hope, and we should hope. But hope comes along with setting goals and creating pathways. So, it's not just wishing, it's hoping, and then acting and creating goals and actions that enable you to enable that. And I would close just by pointing out, as I mentioned, there are lots of emerging focal points in positive education that can enable us to achieve greater self-determination for young people, and to focus on strengths. I've talked in our time together about self-determination. Mindfulness is, focus on mindfulness is emerging. Of course, positive behavioral supports, focus on quality of life. Friendships, they're so important for young people. It ought to be a huge element of our focus in high schools, is and even before that, in enabling and supporting meaningful friendships, focusing on well-being, character strengths. Technology is going to have such a huge role in enabling young people to live successful lives, and then, as I've said, have high expectations. So here are several websites that you can go to that enable you to, there's resources We have resources, for school contexts, for young people themselves to enhance their involvement in educational planning, and we also have some resources expressly for parents and family members. So with that, I would wish you the best. I would just leave you with the firmly held belief that there are lots of exciting opportunities for young people with disability, and that enabling them to become more self-determined helps both them achieve their goals and objectives, but you as a family member to achieve the goals that you have of ensuring that your young adult lives a full, rich life. Thank you.